Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another Wednesday weekly video, and welcome to the Golden Week. Now, the Golden Week is a series of national holidays in Japan filled with reflection, appreciation, and of course, days of rest. So I thought I would make a special series talking about and reflecting on some of these celebratory days within the Golden Week, starting with, on the 29th of April, the Showa Day. Now, the Showa Day is as much about historical reflection as it is about celebrating the life of the Emperor Hirohito. Also known as the Showa Emperor, he ruled from 1926 to 1989. Now, this particular era of history is known as the Showa Era. With each emperor comes a new era of Japanese history. And the reason why the Japanese celebrate this Showa Day of reflection and celebration in some cases is because the 29th of April is Hirohito's birthday. And much like with the Queen's birthday here in the UK, the Emperor's birthday is marked in every calendar, but is not regarded as a national holiday. The Showa Era is the historical reflection aspect of the Showa Day holiday. Now, this era of history saw an incredible change and shift in Japanese culture, economics, and politics. At the beginning of Hirohito's reign, in 1927, there was an economic crisis in Japan, which was exacerbated by the early 1930s with the onset of the Great Depression. Also at the same time, you have the decrease in power of the civilian aspects of government and the dramatic increase in power of the military. This was in part due to a number of sackings and assassinations of a few of Japan's prime ministers. The Japanese Empire, which had already occupied Taiwan by 1895 and Korea by 1910, was increasing its boundaries and territories during the 1930s. In 1931, there was the Mukden incident in the Manchurian region of China. By 1932, the entire Manchurian region was occupied. And in 1937 and 38, the Japanese decided to occupy parts of Inner Mongolia. Now, with tensions running high between China and Japan already after this Mukden incident and Manchurian occupation, this Inner Mongolian section of occupation sparked the Second Sino-Japanese War, which would spill over into the Second World War. Talking of the Second World War, the Americans became increasingly suspicious during 1940 and 1941, imposing economic sanctions on the country. Now, this is because in 1940, the Japanese signed a tripartite agreement with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Now, in this agreement, it was said that should any one of these three nations go to war with, say, France, or any other country for that matter, then the other two would come and assist in their efforts. So while the Nazis were attacking and occupying the French nation, the Japanese took it upon themselves to attack and occupy French Indochina, which is comprised of modern-day Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Then, of course, you have the attack on Pearl Harbor, perpetrated by the Japanese on the 7th of December 1941, drawing the Americans into the fore of the Second World War. Then you have the Burma campaign between 1942 and 1945, where much of the Japanese forces were fighting. With the war in Europe concluded in May 1945 and the Nazis having surrendered, the Soviet Union turned its attention eastwards and declared war on Japan. This put an added pressure on Japanese military and politics, because not only could the Soviet Union attack the northern portions of the Japanese state, but with the retreat of the Japanese army for the Burma campaign, the Allied forces in the south could then close the gap and encircle the Japanese state. So Hirohito had to come to a decision. Should he defend his nation and put the civilian lives at risk, or should he just surrender? With the nuclear bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the decision by Hirohito was made. He would surrender on national radio and bring about the beginning of the occupation period by the Allied commander Douglas MacArthur that would last until 1952, and the beginning of a reconstruction period that would culminate with the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. There are many debates and discussions surrounding how involved Emperor Hirohito was during the Second World War. Some claim that he was more interested in marine biology than in politics and military affairs. Then there is the other side of the argument, who suggests that Emperor Hirohito was the sole decision maker during the Second World War and obviously the early Sino-Japanese War, and that the generals at his disposal were just military advisors or middlemen, just doing as the emperor wished. In more recent years, however, there has been a merging of the two arguments, a more moderate approach. It suggests that whilst Hirohito signed on the dotted line and gave the go-ahead to a number of military attacks and manoeuvres, it was people like General Hideki Tojo, who was Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 to 44, that had the real power when it came to making the decisions during the Second World War, and that the only reason the emperor was consulted and gave the go-ahead to these things is because that was part of the constitution that was around during that period. But despite this historical analysis, in the years following the Second World War, there was a lot of suspicion and antagonism towards the Japanese people, well into the 1970s, in fact. It wasn't until the early 1960s that the United States opened up its borders to tourists from Japan. In 1971, on a trip to the UK, Emperor Hirohito was met with a number of war veterans from the Burma campaign who turned their backs on the emperor in protest due to the Second World War. Now, in 1975, Emperor Hirohito made a trip to the United States, meeting President Gerald Ford. But he also made a number of television appearances and was asked a number of questions surrounding his involvement in the attack on Pearl Harbor and his wider involvement in the Second World War. His involvement has been divided into two separate camps of thought. One suggesting that these responses, these answers, were an admittance that he was solely involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Second World War. But the other half claimed that Emperor Hirohito was deeply saddened by what had happened, and this was a formal apology for what he and his nation had done during that period, during the Second World War. But we do have to ask one fundamental question. Why was Hirohito allowed to continue as the Emperor of Japan when so many other military advisors, like Hideki Tojo, went on trial during the late 1940s for war crimes and sentenced to death? Why was Hirohito let off the hook? Well, Douglas MacArthur made a very good point. He suggested that the imperial banner, the imperial monarchy, was effectively an institution of Japan. Heck, Hirohito is the 124th emperor of Japan. The first emperor, albeit a mythological and legendary emperor, dates back to 660 BC. It is rooted in Japanese culture and in its people. Implementing a new democratic system would be more difficult without the emperor than with the emperor. So the emperor was allowed to keep his job. But in 1946, Emperor Hirohito had to go onto public national radio in Japan and suggest that he was not a god. because that first emperor of Japan from 660 BC was claimed to be the grandson of the sun goddess. And so each and every emperor since then has been a divinely ancestral emperor. So Hirohito had to admit that he was no god, and his powers were curtailed. He was a symbol of Japan and the unity of its people. He's not the head of state like the Queen of England is here today. He is just a symbol of what it means to be Japanese. But he can be a head of state if it is truly necessary. Hirohito wasn't just a monarch, an emperor, a symbol of Japan reserved for the history books. He was also a marine biologist, and a really well-informed one at that. He has 36 separate species of hydroid named after him, which he discovered in Japanese waters. He wrote a number of scientific papers and journal articles surrounding these new species and other surrounding hydroid species in Japanese waters, and even as far as the Red Sea. He would publish these in his scientific laboratory installed in the Imperial Palace between 1967 and 1988, and even had a scientific paper published posthumously in 1995. Now let me clarify and expand on what a hydroid actually is. The closest relative that is commonly known that is a hydroid is a freshwater jellyfish, a polyps, and a Portuguese man-of-war. Emperor Hirohito was finding those sorts of marine life in the waters around Japan. When the emperor died in 1989, the 29th of April, which was his birthday, was renamed Greenery Day after the emperor's love of the environment and his contributions to the scientific community and marine biology. But that was all changed in 2006, when Greenery Day was moved to the 4th of April, and the 29th of April was dedicated to the Showa Day, a historical reflection of the time period that was the imperial reign of Hirohito. The Showa Day, the 29th of April, is a day of historical reflection of the years 1926 to 1989, when the Emperor Hirohito reigned. It is a reflection of the negative aspects and also the positive aspects of that era of Japanese history. But it is also a reflection of the man himself, the Showa Emperor Hirohito, a man who was a marine biologist, who contributed so much to that scientific field, but also a controversial figure. How much involvement did he have in the actions of the Japanese military during the Second World War? Well, I'm now going to conclude this video right here and start by saying that I hope that you have enjoyed what you have seen and you've come to learn something more than maybe what you're traditionally expecting. If you have enjoyed what you've seen and you've learned something new, then click the little thumbs up button down below and maybe even consider subscribing. That would be greatly appreciated. If I have missed anything in this discussion today or in this reflection of history, which, let's be honest, I probably have, then please do drop a comment down below. I would greatly appreciate further information on this subject, and I'm sure other people would do too. Stay tuned for the rest of the Golden Week videos that I will be making over the course of this week. And if you're watching this in the future, then I'm sure a playlist will come up any moment now for you to click and to view all in the series of this Golden Week. And there will also be other links to previous videos and my channel itself. So, see you all later, see you all next week for another Wednesday weekly video, or see you for another Golden Week special. See you later.